Hola, bienvenidos a todos. Thank you for joining me in this talk about welcoming diversity through nature connection. I am Estephanie Martinez-Alfonzo and I go by she, her, they, them pronouns. I am a queer mestiza and Latinx woman from Venezuela. I spent a few years there but was primarily raised in Boston. I now live here on the Wabanaki Dawnland, what we call Maine. And I've lived here for almost 5 years, and I'm feeling myself as a settler on unceded native land and doing my best to walk in a good way. And my identity today is rooted in exploring and remembering my cultural traditions while practicing and sharing decolonization and deep nature connection work. And I'm here today as a Wildwood Path staff member. We at the Wildwood Path have a deep trust in the ecosystem and a deep belief in the wisdom of the interconnecting systems of the world. We trust that if we really listen and pay attention to what the land is saying and teaching, we have an infinite potential for healing and growth. And this workshop will be about how to listen to the land and each other more fully, and for the sake of engaging with one another and the landscape more respectfully and lovingly. Before really diving in, let's start by connecting with ourselves as part of the places where we currently are and access what we're feeling grateful for today. Starting with gratitude this way helps us to set a good foundation for the rest of our work. I know it can be challenging over this remote format, but I hope that you will join me in taking a moment and really feeling into what you feel grateful for today. And what helps me do this is to drop into my senses. Let's take a deep breath and notice where your body is in this moment. As you breathe, feel what you are grateful for, who or what forces are allowing you to be here. See if you can find that in your heart. Today I'm feeling really grateful for even being here and shooting this video with you, and really grateful that you're even thinking about engaging in this topic. And I wonder, as you were accessing your gratitude or were listening to mine, what came up for you? When I access my gratitude, I often feel joy and abundance, but I also sometimes feel grief. So I have a few emotional invitations for you as we continue through the video. And the first one is to acknowledge your grief. These are hard times that we're living in, and we're being asked to grow as humans within a broader context. We have a chance to make changes and influence the systems that are harming people, place, and the planet. In order to do that, we can't bury or hide away our grief. We'll just operate from a place of unhealed wounds, leading the way for us. So we invite you to notice your grief, give it a silent acknowledgement, or perhaps write it down on a piece of paper and commit to offering its space later to be processed. Honor it as an expression of love, and know that your grief is also a contribution to this work, and lead from that place of love. And the second is to keep your humility. Come with an open mind and an open heart. Wildwood asks folks to not reject things out of hand, but also to not accept them out of hand. So just think it over and try it out in your own mind and your own experiences, and see what you learn and what you can work with. And part of keeping humility is listening deeply. Many people come to diversity trainings or workshops expecting a checklist of how to interact with people of color. And this is well-intentioned, but every situation is radically different. And expecting a certain response to fit each one is just inauthentic. It can encourage and perpetuate the same patterns of racial discrimination that we're working to get away from. So this workshop is not a list of responses, but an invitation into a way of thinking that will help you engage with all people in a more healthy way. And there are a few things that I want to discuss as we explore the lessons nature teaches us about navigating multiracial relationships within these living systems and uplifting people of color, particularly in predominantly white rural spaces. And some of these concepts may seem simple, but please trust me that they are weaving together to form an invitation into a radically different way of thinking. So even if I'm talking about something that you have a lot of experience with, I'm just asking you to please stay with me and go a little bit deeper. And we want to invite you to join us in thinking about these natural lessons and uncovering your own deep knowings about these questions that are coming from your own relationships and your own relationships with nature and culture. There are two practices that we have found really valuable at the Wildwood Path for learning in these ways, and I want to share them with you as foundations to think about in this workshop. The first one is awareness, like awareness of difference between species of plants and animals, which relates to more than the non-human and the human world. Who are you noticing in your surroundings right now? And the second is relationships. Relationships can be complicated, right? And even when they seem simple, they're often not. When we're tracking a deer, there is a lot more happening than just tracking a deer. We are moving through many animals' homes. We are following a discrete individual for purposes that they don't understand. We're like interrupting songbirds and creating disturbances that predators might use for wake hunting. There are just so many dynamics at play, more than most of us will even be able to see. And what about power differentials? For example, what are the dynamics of power between a coyote and a bear versus a nuthatch and a chickadee? And what can these teach us about navigating multiracial relationships? I might have a thing or two to say about that later, so if you stick around, you can find out. Okay, so keeping those four things in mind, actually I have a piece of paper helping you remember this. Acknowledging grief, maintaining humility, awareness, and relationships. I'll hang it up for you. Can you see that? Yeah. So let's get into it, starting with non-binary thinking. We are taught polarized thought. Things are either right or wrong, true or false, black or white. And nature and in all reality, this reductionist way of thinking never tells the whole story. One thing might be true and something totally contradictory can also be true. And when we practice noticing these things, they begin to jump out at us all the time. It seems that nature loves paradox like this one. Imagine a dead tree. Really picture it. This tree is not alive, it's not respirating or growing or reproducing or anything, it's dead. Now imagine walking up to it and pulling some of the crumbling bark away with your hand. The powdery remains of the cambium layer lie underneath as a thick dust. In that dust you see some black dots, and those are ant droppings. You then see a few ants scurrying away, and there are probably more in there. You then find the layer of white fungal mat inside the bark. And maybe there's a bird or even a porcupine nested in it. And these things are eating the tree, and the tree's life is becoming them. At what point then, when an ant bites a decomposing cambium layer, does it become the ant? Sometimes the poop of bugs that eat wood look a lot like the wood itself. Is the dead tree no longer a tree while it is the ant? the lines get so blurry and quickly lose all meaning. The ants and the mushrooms and the porcupines and the poop are the dead tree, and those beings are very much alive. We're right in calling it a dead tree, it is, but we're also completely wrong in calling it a dead tree because it's full with life. So if you're both right and you're wrong, what are you? Well, the tree is showing us a third way of thinking. Look around and notice how nature might be demonstrating this concept near you. What can you observe that is more than just the either or? How is nature showing an example of non-binary thinking? And this non-binary mode of thought is foundational to a deeper understanding of race relations. Let me give you this example. It's a little hard to hear, but bear with me and follow me through. In a research study at the University of Milano Bicocca in Italy, I think it was, a group of white people were shown pictures of other white people in painful situations. Predictably, their brains registered empathetic pain. They imagined that the people in the picture felt hurt, and they felt hurt for them. Then, the same group of people were showed a series of pictures of black men in the same painful situations. Can you guess how they responded? When showed these images, the group of white people did not experience anything like the same empathetic responses neurologically. And the people in these studies and these experiments are not overt racists, but they have been subtly shaped to only see white people as fully human. Often the race that is exclusively humanized is the white one in Western culture, but there have been other studies and other examples, and the particular race really is not my point. My point is when we are trapped in binary thought, these cultural lenses are very hard to escape. A black or a native, Asian or Latino person is forever just that, a black or Latino, a native or an Asian person. And this practice of non-binary thinking allows us to step around those deep cultural preconceptions and see someone both as a person of color and also as an individual human like everybody else and ourselves. And so the tree is both dead and also alive. I'm going to ask you to carry this with you for the rest of this workshop. So take a moment and breathe into that awareness of a deeper truth that the tree is both dead and alive. And I bring it up this way because I know that I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of these cultural preconceptions, and also understand that escaping these lenses within ourselves is just not an easy thing. It doesn't change overnight, but we just have to work on it. Which brings me to a point about noticing and releasing preconceptions. Humans in particular are amazing at seeing patterns. Our brains are constantly compiling bits of information based on all of our experiences in life. And we automatically connect dots to paint a picture so that we can say, yes, this is that thing. And this is an incredible strength that it's also how we can see tracks and know what animal made them. It's how we identify plants. It's really helpful. But have you ever had an experience where you think you know something, but then you look just a little bit deeper and you realize that it's totally different? This is where our incredible skill at pattern extrapolation can also be harmful. Our expectations of certain patterns become preconceptions, and sometimes those preconceptions are taught for generations. We are taught a certain way of thinking, and it just becomes what we believe, even if we have little or no experience with the facts about the subject of our beliefs. So I brought a whiteboard with me to do a quick exercise. Here's a dot. And since it's a single point, it can't be a pattern, and we're talking about patterns, so let's add another dot. What shape are these two dots in? My mind automatically draws a line between them. Now what is it? I see a triangle, but it's not a triangle, is it? It's just three dots. And even if it is a triangle, what if it's not a triangle at all? What if it's actually a square? Because we just didn't see this other dot. It's kind of a funny looking square, but what if it's not a square at all either? And what if it's actually this ball? And even now, what if it's not a ball, but it's a hole in the ground? If it's a very deep hole in the ground and we were standing at the bottom, it would be a round point far away. So it would go right back to being that first dot that we started with. So when I told you that the single point could not be a pattern, that was also not the whole truth. Remember how we were talking about deferring to non-binary thinking? Viewed from another galaxy, every star you have ever seen is all part of one dot in the sky. And when we look up in the sky on a starry night, a star could actually be a whole other galaxy, but to us it looks like just one star. And so our perspective determines what data we can see, and what data we can see informs patterns we think we are encountering. So when we call it a triangle, it was because we only had a few little data points, and the pattern that we put onto those points was the simplest one that explained them. And let me tell you a quick story. I was out canoeing a couple weeks ago with my partner when I heard a distinct, resonant, woody hoo hoo. If I was better at hooting, I would probably do that for you, but I'm not, so that's what you got. So there's two data points. And immediately I thought, oh, it's an owl. This is the shape of my owl call. When I heard those 2 points, I immediately filled in the rest of the circle. But then I heard the rest of the call. And it happened to be a mourning dove. And so my mind had immediately filled in the pattern based on the little bit of information that I had. And it was completely wrong. And we do this all the time. Take a minute to look around your space. What do you see? Now take the things that you see and make them the background. What's in between them? What is there that you just looked at and didn't see before? What's between those bushes or underneath that table? And all of this can obviously be true for our relationships with people as well. We might think we totally get someone or something about their circumstances or know that type, but when we drop our preconceptions, we can often learn really incredible things. And this can help welcome diverse peoples into our lives because we're not putting our preconceived ideas about folks onto them when we meet them. And it's just good to be aware that we hold biases and stereotypes. But if we let them go, we can try and show up with new eyes and see brand new faces and people for who they are. And with compassion. Relating to the wilderness, some find it hard to immediately think of her as showing compassion. Never mind teaching about it. That nature is red and tooth and claw. It's really worth questioning this narrative as we do at the Wildwood Path. In our communities, we're out here gathering wild and cultivated plants. We're taking care of pigs and chickens, tending our gardens and saving seeds. And are noticing that the land is constantly, generously making more than is needed, sharing with others, and continuing to feed us even when we don't realize it. Because in this world of consumerism, we don't think twice about it and simply might be ignorant or confused of how to even relate. So let's talk about that more. We know plants like trees need carbon and other elements to grow. And in most Western education, we learn this as being inherently competitive. That the trees are each vying for the same resources, taking as much as they can, and that there are those that will make it and those that don't. That there are winners and losers. Okay, that's one way of looking at the forest. If we look at the forest that way, though, it's going to reinforce certain beliefs and ways of thinking that about nature, about the nature of being for us. It teaches certain lessons about relationships and community dynamics. But let's look a little bit closer. As a lot of us know, plants have this incredible relationship with specific fungi. And these fungi inhabit tree roots and create a vast, interconnected subterranean web which connect all the trees across the forest. There's a German forester, Peter Wolleben, I think, who calls us the Wood Wide Web, which I think is kind of cute. Anyway, this web creates pathways between trees and fungi, and the fungi allows the plants to communicate and access nutrients from the soil. For example, the trees communicate through roots and together share carbon and nutrients with one another if one happens to be struggling. And this takes place both on an annual cycle wherein hardwoods, which have more resources in the summertime when they are in leaf, share with their slightly shaded softwoods neighbors when they are rich, and softwoods do the same for the hardwoods in the wintertime. And the fungi in these mycorrhizal relationships both benefit and contribute as well, gaining carbon and offering trace nutrients. It's an incredible natural system, it blows my mind. And so, can you see the metaphors in those teachings? The words that come to mind for me are mutual support and compassion. What do you think of when you hear the word compassion? I think about friends. I think about my family and my neighbor and my community and that stranger at the grocery store. What does my neighbor need? What does my community member need that I might have resources to and can provide? And I'd like to share a fairly intense story of an experience that I had a few weeks ago. I processed firewood for the first time this year. Our friends gave us permission to fell a few trees on the land that they tend. And this was exciting. We brought our axes and chainsaws and other tools for this. And we stood there in front of the tree line. And it was in our process of prayer and asking that I was thinking about the history of the land, our impacts, and realizing what it really was that we were actually asking. The lands that we occupy carry a lot of trauma, and the traumas both of the native people who were killed and displaced, and traumas of the land itself, which has been exploited and brutalized by the same people who killed and displaced the native people who lived here for millennia. And the forest that we were standing on or in front of had quickly learned in a hard way that humans are not always safe. So how do we approach a forest that has been traumatized in that way? How do we acknowledge the impacts we are having? Is it possible to cut firewood in a way that benefits a wounded forest, or is that just a question reverting back to a form of apologetics for ongoing harm? And so the question was, how do we build a relationship rooted in reciprocity with land and people as we're asking this tree to die for us, to give up their lives and their futures, negating their ability to produce children or food. And those trees were being asked to give up not just their lives, but their entire lineage. And I just wept. I wasn't sure that we were worthy of those gifts. And it was throughout this process, as we stood there, we reminded ourselves that our friends are tending that land. They're asking and giving and trying to develop healthier relationships with her. And in many ways, I was too. It's not always perfect, but I know that isn't the point as I strip away what I thought I knew and relearning all of my own beliefs and way of living. So as a community member, we are there both to support their relationship with that land, our relationship with all land in these processes, and also meeting our needs for the winter. And that's a really delicate balance. So we did what we felt was right, and we listened to the land as best we could. We prayed and we sang and we courted and we asked, and the land gave. And this informs our reparations practices as well, and sharing the abundance, moving away from hoarding it into a flow of wealth and privilege that doesn't center my personal security, but rather attends to the broader whole within which my security lies in. And it's so clear to me that this tree is not defending their own life to the detriment of the whole. Obviously, they do things to support their health and survival, like releasing certain chemicals that prevent certain plants from growing too close that might be harmful to them. And it's a boundary that they set, but it's also simultaneously rooted in the context where they are fully willing to help their neighbor and willing to die if necessary for the sake of the health of the system that they are in, for the bigger and the broader whole. And as we're speaking about relationships, this work of asking and listening and moving toward health is really powerful and necessary. But when we focus on these practices as though we are already equals, we can miss important pieces. Remember I had mentioned the coyote and the bear and the birds? Imagine a dead deer in the woods. A coyote is eating it, and a big black bear comes along and wants to eat the deer. What does the coyote do? Of course she runs away. Now imagine the nuthatches and the chickadees at your bird feeder. A chickadee is eating and a nuthatch flies in. The chickadee will usually just hop over a little bit to make room, or maybe they will fly loops to take turns grabbing seeds. And the difference here is one of power. The black bear is much bigger and stronger. In one way, it is more powerful of an animal than the coyote is. The nuthatch and the chickadee are almost the same size and have very similar amounts of power in that way. And this is what I mean when I talk about power differential. The chickadee and the nuthatch can have a more fair and balanced conversation because there's almost no power differential. And the coyote and the bear simply cannot. The coyote simply has to leave or even forfeit her life. So when we pay attention to these lessons that nature is teaching us, they can be very helpful in seeing, for example, what a power differential is. Sometimes we can more easily imagine what it would feel like to be that coyote than we can what it feels like to be a black fourth grader with a white teacher. And it's important to notice those differences between these analogies and these racial realities, though, because the differences can be as informative as the comparisons. And the biggest difference that I notice here is that the power differential between the coyote and the bear is a natural one. It's a function of who and what they are. Conversely, the power differential between a Latino immigrant and a white US citizen is constructed. It has nothing to do with their innate nature. And in another social structure, it could be the opposite. And wow, we can really lose sight of this. People such as those who wrote and believed the ethical justifications for slavery think that the power differentials between races and nationalities was a natural one. And many of us, even people of color, have internalized those teachings in subtle and difficult to extract ways. I notice it in myself, and it's a real struggle. Those ethical justifications for slavery and genocide continue to live in our cultural mindset. They have become more subtle and harder to track, but they are still alive and well in our collective subconscious. And as we too are taking part in the making of history, it is each of our duty to root out those poisonous lies in our communities and ourselves. In that example, the natural analogy doesn't paint the whole story, but sometimes the natural analogy paints more than the whole story, because there are lessons on either side of the power differential. Think back to the trees that I was asking to process firewood. There is a power differential between myself and those trees. I'm holding the tools that can take their lives, and they cannot expressly fight back. In this way, they're teaching those of us in positions of less power how to stand with integrity and solidarity. How can we teach people who have power over us? How can we stand in such beauty and integrity that to even think of impacting us brings tears to the eyes of those holding the axe? As a quick side note, I do want to name here that all analogies are limited. As we saw and heard, the trees there stood tall with a willingness to make a sacrifice. Sometimes when there are people in positions of power over you, the lessons you need is how to fight like hell, like a cornered animal, and how to fight for your life and your children's lives as if they depended on it. And nature can teach us this as well, and powerfully. People in positions of power think of those positions as natural, as a fundamental right. From this place, when they are asked to share power and wealth and resources or engage in a more equitable way, it feels like they're being asked to die. And in some ways they are. That version of themselves that has been given so much privilege, that in its existence it's oppressive to others, is being asked to die. It's not an easy thing. If others' history is any precedent, they will find another healthier, happier version of themselves without that unhealthy, oppressive level of privilege. Knowing this intellectually does not make the process of letting that part of themselves die any easier, though. And I just wonder, are we capable of the generosity and the selflessness that the trees teach? Can we show up with the same willingness to transform like those trees, and every being in our meals that we eat teaches us every single day? So what does this mean for a person seeking to welcome diversity? We have to pay attention and notice and practice doing so, and bring it into our own spaces, on our farms, in our work, at our schools, in our homes, and notice how we are tending our relationships and the dynamics within them. Have conversations with the people around you and what they notice and what they wonder, whether it's about the natural world or the manipulated systems in which we live in. Ask questions and engage critically, but also lovingly. Have dialogues with people and the world around you, the birds and the porcupines and the rains when they come, anyone. Those are relationships too. Practice non-binary thinking, letting go of our preconceptions, having compassion, and try to see people as individuals. Ask yourself, are you able to see people as individuals while also seeing them nested within the systems of their circumstances? A few weeks ago, I was spending some time at a lakeshore in Maine and found myself curiously thinking about all of the species that live there and was wondering what their contributions and their value to this place they call home were. Each of them had something special to offer, of course, a unique role to play. There's an area on that lake that we call Loon Bay where we often see loons pop up here and there. I thought in that moment, is that loon part of a family or is it just a loon alone? Either way, what's the role of this loon? What important loon jobs do they tend to? I saw them as a loon and also as influenced by everyone and everything around them, and the loon influencing them as well. I don't know the answers to these questions, but I'm just paying attention. And regardless of the answers, I'm just amazed to see this loon and to hear their song and notice their stunning patterns and how big they are. I'm seeking to appreciate the unique existence of this loon while also seeing them within the systems around that I too am a part of. I want to take a moment and zoom out on this topic just a little bit. What led us to this workshop in the first place? Why are we even talking about welcoming diversity? Why is this land so diverse to begin with? And if you're anywhere in the Americas, for most of human history, it was diverse in a very different way. It was a community of Native Americans with some traders and travelers from other places here and there. Now, because of the violence of colonization, much of this unceded land hosts a very diverse community of humans who call it home. And hold that thought, and let's talk about plants for a second. For many years, scientists call new plants seeking homes in our ecosystem invasive. And this term has always been a little loose, but we generally have understood it to mean a species that is new to an area and propagates in a way that limits available habitat for native species. So Phragmite, the reed grass, is an invasive species that interrupts cattail habitat. Japanese knotweed is an invasive species that interrupts sumac and other habitats. And the common approaches to these invasive species are aggressive mitigation techniques, which often amounts to killing and limiting them as much as possible for the sake of preserving habitat. This is understandable, but it's not the only possible response. And often, it's not that effective and even counterproductive. There's an elder that we know in our community, Grandfather Ray, and he takes a really different approach. Around the same time that Japanese knotweed showed up on his land some 20 years ago, he began hearing about how problematic it was. He gave it a space and invited it into that space. He said, here you go. You can grow here and make yourself at home here. When it grew anywhere else on the land, he would cut it back, but in that grove, he celebrated it and made it welcome. Eventually, we learned that Japanese knotweed is one of the most potent allies against Lyme disease, and Grandfather Ray looked a little prescient for having this huge, healthy patch on his land. But he didn't do it for the medicine. He did it because it felt like the friendly and welcoming thing to do for a new community member. And the other thing to consider here is the context in which we're using the word invasive. Climate change is pushing ecosystems away from the equator. But within that large trend, small ecosystems are being moved and rewritten in wildly unpredictable ways. While we like to think of the land as stable, it really isn't. It's constantly moving and shifting, and climate change is making that happen faster and less predictably than ever. So when we call a species invasive, in many ways we are describing the rapidly shifting state of our ecosystems more than we are describing the individual species. Seeing how humans cause and continue aggressively exacerbating climate change, it begins to seem somewhat self-critical when we call species invasive for their migration in response to change in their climate. And often when we criticize others, we're really criticizing ourselves. And sometimes I wonder if the people, like children of immigrants, so harshly judging other species immigration, are really judging their own ancestors' patterns of violent displacement of Native people. Climate change is not slowing down, and we're living through a crisis right now. All of the other challenges in politics, social, racial justice, economics, and other issues are happening in front of this overwhelming backdrop of this climate crisis. The equatorial zones are simultaneously becoming rapidly desertified and losing coastal zones to sea level rise. The over-extraction of natural resources continues to contribute to this climate crisis, along with the exploitation of humans, all combined with political instability. These impacts are resulting in the largest refugee crisis we have ever seen over the next few decades. And this is not a question. The refugees fleeing these places now are leaving because of the changes in their climate that are threatening their chances of survival and the survival of future generations. So they're seeking a more hospitable climate, just like the plants that come into your backyard. Like the invasive species, it's never the individuals themselves who are changing their climate. The changes that are forcing them to leave are manufactured, whether by industrial climate change or violent, dehumanizing politics. By not creating pathways for these refugees to enter into our communities in a healthy way that contextualizes them and celebrates their strengths and their skills and their approaches to life and their own lives, we become perpetrators of unthinkable things, and also deny a potential solution to the challenges that we face. One of the principles of permaculture is that the solution always lies within the problem. Sometimes this is not a straight line, but it's absolutely true. Grandfather Ray's tending of the Japanese knotweed, which then emerges as the cure for another invasive disease like Lyme, is a really good example of this. Climate change and its resulting refugee crisis will move a lot of people and energy around on this planet. How are you building pathways in your communities for refugees and immigrants to engage in healthy and loving ways? How are you supporting your neighbors to see these upcoming changes not as threats, but as opportunities for healthier and happier ways of being? These issues are complicated, and if we try to reduce the solutions with natural analogies or oversimplification, we can end up seeming to justify patterns that we absolutely don't support. So when I talk about creating pathways for healthy community, integration of refugees, I'm not supporting the further theft of native land. This is the last thing that we want. We need to find ways to make reparations, support land sovereignty, indigenous land sovereignty, build relationships, and share our resources to uplift Indigenous leaders' voices. Indigenous leadership and their visions have proven time and time again the most effective and the healthiest path forward in these crises that we find ourselves in. We need to find ways to make this world a healthier and safer place for all of us that are now here, and to welcome those that have yet to come. So, remember how we were talking about thinking outside the binary paradigms? How can we simultaneously support Indigenous land sovereignty and also create healthy pathways for refugees and immigrants fleeing climate crisis and its interwoven political turmoil? What can we do to balance the power dynamics in all of these relationships so that we're not always the bears and the coyotes trying to work out a fair deal? Nature teaches us of ways that we can escape the binary by inviting us into noticing the many identities of that entities hold. When I look at a mushroom, I notice that the mushroom is not just a mushroom. They're also parents, composters, contemporary dancers, feast for deer, and have many other identities that I probably don't even know about. So when I think about the multiple identities that each of us holds, I can access more respect for individual people within the systems of privilege and oppression that we live in. With people, there's often a difference between seeing them compassionately as individuals and also seeing them compassionately within their social roles. If you see me as just a Venezuelan immigrant, you are not seeing my individuality. You're reducing me to a demographic of peoples as only one part of who I am. And if you try to see me as an individual isolated from my cultural context as a Venezuelan immigrant, you won't be able to see my individuality clearly because you're blocking out a lot of what makes me who I am. Breathe back into your non-binary thinking. Are you able to recognize how I am both a unique individual and also the result of the racial and political and climate systems of being a Venezuelan immigrant? See, you can totally do both. So, before I leave in just a minute here are our invitations for you. If you came here looking for a checklist, this is probably the closest that you're gonna get. Let me hang up this paper for you too. We want to practice non-binary thinking. Pay attention, looking beyond what you can already see. Attend to relationships as both as individuals and as part of larger systems. Give back and practice what you learn and give credit to who you learned from. And stay in touch with us. Let me tell you a little bit about what we have going on here at the Wildwood Path. We have 6 cohorts opening up this fall, in October actually, 2 all online cohorts for all genders, and 4 in person for women and trans folks. We also work with individuals and organizations who are working to integrate living systems thinking into their lives and their work, and are taking a couple of new clients this season. And we're happy to lead workshops every now and again if folks are requesting them. So please find us online and sign up for our newsletter. Apply for a cohort. We'd love to see you, or reach out about working with us. And if that's not already big and exciting news, we are also trying to build a pandemic pavilion in order to keep our offerings accessible in these challenging times. So we would be so grateful for any donations that you feel called to contribute. More information, of course, is available online if you search for the Wildwood Path. And I want to thank you so much for your interest in this workshop and being here with me and sticking through. And thank you for the work that you're doing to try and welcome diversity into your lives and into your spaces, and to develop yourselves as people who make the world a better place for everyone.